Hi, everybody. Welcome to La Lista, a LatinX writers podcast. I am your host, Ruben Mendive, and today we have a brand new guest here. I'm so glad to have this writer on, and I like to start each episode by having my guests introduce themselves. So your name and how you identify for the people at home.
Hi, Ruben. How I identify is Earthling first, then species human, then hey, how are you? I'm Richie Narvaez, LatinX writer, he, him, his, and all that. Nice to meet you.
Where are you from? And what's the short version? What's the long version?
Aha. Well, the very short version is Los Sures in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. South 1st, South 2nd, South 3rd in the northwestern part of Brooklyn. Born and raised there. That's a short story. The long version. So my parents come from Puerto Rico. My mother comes from a town in the south called Ponce, known for its intellectuals and its rebels. My father comes from a mountain town called Corozal in about the northeast. So they were both children of the Depression, which you may know hit Puerto Rico much harder than it did the rest of the United States. United States, you had unemployment at about 25%. Puerto Rico was like 35%. This is in part because of the policies of the United States, which pretty much screwed over Puerto Rico as soon as it became a commonwealth. Anyway, as soon as they got older, both of them were ambitious. They wanted more out of their lives. Operation Bootstrap was happening in Puerto Rico. There was even more unemployment. There were no jobs. My mother came to the United States. She had some relatives here. She eventually got her GED, became a practical nurse. My father, well, according to legend, he might not have left for ambition so much as, well, he used to sell clothes in Puerto Rico, women's dresses that may or may not have fallen off a truck, if you know what I mean. And he might have gotten too friendly with a customer, and her husband was not happy. So my father joined the Merchant Marine, and he traveled around the world, but eventually ended up in New York City. There was where a lot of Puerto Ricans were migrating to during the 1950s. They met at, I think it was the Copa. I'm not exactly sure, but certainly a Latin club in the 50s. My mother didn't want to date my father. She knew that he was a bit slick, mujeriego, but she wanted to date his cousin, who was more reliable. However, they became good friends. Eventually, though, they got together, and my mother and father had 3 kids. Because they were children of the Depression, they instilled in us a need to work, and that it was important to get ahead and get an education. So my mother moved into an apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. My father did not live with us because he unfortunately kept to some stereotypical Puerto Rican traditions of having other families. You may have heard this in other Latinx cultures. It's something I believe we've adopted from the Spanish. We had a nice apartment in Williamsburg. I went to PS 84, junior high school 50, went to Brooklyn Tech, and somehow along the way I decided to become a writer. Part of that was, my mother and father both impressing on me the importance of education.
So I think you might be the first person I've interviewed who's grown up in New York. I grew up in Chicago, so I know the city kid life is a little different than the suburbs.
Yes.
So I am curious, what was it like growing up in New York? What was your neighborhood like? What was the scene? Can you describe it to us?
Oh, sure, man. This is actually, it was wonderful and it was frightening at the same time. I grew up in New York City during the 1970s, and New York City was experiencing heavy-duty economic strife. There was a lot of unemployment. Inflation was going crazy. There was a sanitation strike, all this trouble. So there was also a lot of gang life, a lot of violence on the streets. But at the same time, we lived in Williamsburg. The neighborhood was your block. That was like your entire world. At least as a young kid, from corner to corner, you knew everybody on the block. And we hung out on the stoop, in front of the stoop. We played kick the can, Johnny on the Pony. These very sometimes quite violent and aggressive games. We played Skelly right in the streets. and it was fun. We knew each other. Back in those days, your parents could say, "Go downstairs, like get out of the house," and we would be outside all day and come in smelling of the street and sweaty and like the blacktop. But it was okay. We didn't have the internet. We watched cartoons like crazy. But back then, we lived a lot outside. And it was a lot of fun. And one of the things that is key to my growing up is I was there during the blackout of 1977, which was a very frightening time because there had been a previous blackout in the 60s. And it went fairly straightforwardly. But I think everybody who had been through the one in the 60s realized, wait a second, we can break through store windows. So there was unfortunately, a lot of looting. So it was a very scary night to live through. Very dramatic, and it was one of the hallmarks of my childhood. I will say that Williamsburg was very mixed. It was a very Puerto Rican area, but we still had a lot of Polish, Irish, German, African American, some Dominicans that were starting to move in, some Asian. So it was nice to have a sort of a diverse area, even though later on it became much more heavily Puerto Rican, and then eventually becomes heavily gentrified, which is one of the things I often write about in my work.
I like to get a sense of people during their high school years, 14 to 18. I frame it in who were you, right. Who were you pretending to be, and how did other people see you?
Do we have to get into this? Because you could be my therapist for this. I should pay you to get into my high school years. Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And in fact, the book I wrote, Holly Hernandez and the Death of Disco, is one of my most recent works where I really got into my high school years. So I went to high school in 1979. Let me put it this way. I went to an elite high school called Brooklyn Tech. At junior high school 50, John D. Wells in Brooklyn, I had done really well, partly, again, because my mother and father's push for education. I was the student who the teacher would say, well, Richie knows the answer, if nobody else knew the answer. So which was kind of embarrassing, but also kind of a boost to my ego. So I felt special in junior high school. And in fact, I became the valedictorian. So then I take this test for the advanced high schools in New York City. There's only 3 back then. I'm the only one in my school to get in. So I get into high school, and I was never the most social kid. I was socially awkward. But, I still had a lot of friends in junior high school because I had known a lot of those people since kindergarten. I get to high school, I know no one, which was frightening in one way. The other thing is I had felt very special in junior high school because he's the brainiac. He's Poindexter, as my sister used to say. I get to high school, an elite high school, everyone else in the school is a Poindexter, is a brainiac. And all of a sudden my specialness kind of dissipated. And there were these other kids were amazing. They knew how to do all this trigonometry and advanced math. I was like, I know my algebra, and that was good for me, but not for they were amazing. It was a blow to my ego, my nascent ego, as it was growing as a 14-year-old. So I got shyer. I kind of shrank into myself, I think. And it took a while for me to feel comfortable and to figure out who I was in this community of brainiacs. One thing, I did eventually make friends, but it took a while. I had to be able to open myself up, understand, I guess, my sense of humor, what my character was. But for a long time, I avoided people. I would go, the cafeteria was very cliquey. There was definitely a section with the football guys, a section with the beautiful teenagers, a section with the super nerds, but I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. So I used to get free lunch tickets because my family was in a poverty bracket. So I used to sell my lunch tickets for like $1 or something. And the food was awful anyway, too. It would make my stomach hurt. So I would take that money and I would just go to the library every day. And I did that for maybe the first year and a half of high school. I hid in the library for lunch every day. I made friends with the librarian. He was a really nice man. And he understood that I was avoiding something, that I was shy. And he was like, oh, why aren't you in the cafeteria and stuff? But eventually I did make enough friends and I was able to navigate high school better. But it took a while, and it's still a lot of memories of unrequited crushes and feeling foolish and stupid a lot, not feeling adequate. Eventually, one thing, actually bringing it back to writing, I took a creative writing class in high school, and that really helped me with Ms. Finnegan. She was really helpful. I took 2 semesters of her. And in that class, again, I felt special. I felt like I had something that could be grown, some sort of craft that I could work on. And it was the class, it was small, and we were constantly reading stories. And you know, as a writer, when you write, it's sort of that whole thing of cutting open a vein. It's a very intimate thing when you show people your work. And when you have a close-knit group and a creative writing group that stays together for a while, you get close, you get to know people. And in that class, I felt more free, you know, I learned to be braver. I learned to be a bit more confident in that class. And that's one of the places where I said, oh, maybe writing could be something I can do.
Yeah, you know, that's so funny because in Chicago, the high schools are set up similarly. Like,
okay, yeah,
you have to sort of like test into them. And I think when I went to high school, there was like 5 of them. And you hope you prayed you got into one of those because you don't want to go to the neighborhood school.
Yeah, no, we had 2 neighborhood schools in Williamsburg that had really bad reputations. And it was just like, oh man, your life is done. If you're going to Eli Whitney, that's it. Or if you're going to Eastern District, forget it. You know, you didn't have many options, basically.
It was interesting because at the time you feel like, it feels very much like you're applying to college. Like it's,
yes.
Looking back, you're just like, oh, the educational system is just like, we're just going to give a shot to these kids at these school. And the rest, it's like fend for yourself, you know?
I love the elite high school experience, but I just don't understand why money couldn't be found. The policies couldn't be found to make every school like this. It was Brooklyn Tech is and continues to be. It's a beautiful WPA building built during the Depression. Wonderful design. All these the best labs and machinery and stuff. It was a wonderful experience. What, you know, we need to, you know, we've always needed to spend more money on education. I don't know why we look at schools as like, oh yeah, let the teachers get their own chalk.
And then I think it also sets up like your value and worth as like a 14-year-old, and depending on what high school you go to. And
yeah.
But I'm curious of like what you did after high school. Like, did you have a plan? Did you sort of know what you wanted to pursue?
I decided to go to Stony Brook, State University of New York at Stony Brook, out on Long Island, because I didn't know exactly why, but I knew I did not want to be home after college. And seriously, there was just something in me that said, do not live here and go. Possibly it was because the movie Animal House had come out. So I was like, well, that's the college experience I want. I want to have a toga. But I think it was just part of me just needed that adventure, needed to see something, new vistas somewhere. So I went to Stony Brook. And here's the thing. Stony Brook is known for, it has a wonderful medical program, pre-med program, and then it has a doctoral thing you go into. But it also has astronomy. And I said, damn it, I'm going to be the first Puerto Rican astronaut, because there had not been one back then. And that will be me, because I want to be like Captain Kirk, but I'm going to be the Puerto Rican Captain Kirk. I'm going to see the stars. But since I didn't have 20/20 vision and I didn't have the laser thing to fix your eyes, I said, I'll go in as a scientist. Somehow they'll let me on the spaceship because I'll be a brilliant scientist. And that was the plan. That was the actual plan. And then, so and by the way, so yes, I had enjoyed writing, but my parents, this is going to resonate throughout. My parents had sacrificed so much to put me through school and now to pay for me to go to college, that I was like, well, I have to become a doctor or an astronaut or something that makes money. I'm not going to become a writer. Writers don't make any money. That's an artist. And the artist's life, I felt, was like kicking my parents. Like, oh yeah, I want to become an artist. And for me, that was just like somebody living in a tiny, cold apartment in the village. I was like, no, I've got to become something, because I have to justify everything that my parents had done for me. Unfortunately, I took physics and then I took astronomy. After about a semester and a half, I realized the level of math here, the level of science here, I can kind of get it, but it wasn't appealing to my gypsy soul, if you know what I mean. It just was not hitting me. However, my English courses, I was just loving them. I was adoring my lit classes. Poetry was dazzling me. Writing fiction, this is what I want to do. But it's like, I can't become an English major. English majors just end up becoming teachers, and teachers are suckers. I'm going to become a teacher. Who wants to do that? They never make any money. But my heart went out. And so the plan, again, was to become the first Puerto Rican astronaut. But I became an English major in college, and I loved it. And then I actually ended up staying partially because I was afraid of going to the real world. I had, in junior high school, I had skipped a grade from 7 to 9. So I was 20 years old when I graduated college, and the real world was still too intimidating for me. So I went right into a master's program for creative writing so that I could just delay adulthood just a smidge longer. And so it kind of worked out. I might have just kept delaying it for much longer than that. Who knows?
And so like, what were your parents' thought on all this? Like changing your major, going to grad school, like how do they feel about it?
I think they were not upset, actually. I think my mother was happy when I said, I'm going to become an astronaut. She's like, oh, that's great. That's wonderful. She's very proud, very encouraging. And then actually in the middle of my sophomore year, I thought, I don't think this astronaut thing is working, but I could become a doctor. This was my thinking. I was, 18. I didn't know what was going to happen. And then I realized I didn't want to become a doctor pretty quickly also. But she was so excited. I didn't exactly tell her I was an English major till I think my senior year. But then I was going to grad school and I said, well, my plan is to become a PhD. And that was the plan. And I will be a doctor. And she didn't mind that I wasn't going to be like Ben Casey or somebody on ER or on TV. She just liked the idea of my being a doctor. But I never they never said, oh, don't do that. They were never discouraging. The thing was, I was the first person in my family to go to college. So that was a very significant thing anyway. And I was not leaving. My brother is very intelligent, but he went only one semester. He just didn't like it. It didn't take. And my father, just going back to his other families, he had 9 kids altogether. And I was the only one of them to go to college. So for him, he's just like, yeah, whatever you want, just go. Just keep going and don't leave. They never gave me a hard time about it.
When you went to college, did you notice like any difference between growing up in New York and then going to like a different place and outside the city? And like, I'm curious of like what that experience was like.
Oh, that's good. And actually, I still have to write about that. I think I've only touched on it a little bit. So I'm a Brooklyn boy, born and raised, right? I had been used to concrete and blacktop under my Converse sneakers ever since I was a little kid. So I decided to go to Stony Brook, which is super suburban near the tip of Long Island. And for me, it was a major culture change. Everything was green. It was green. It's a beautiful campus. Green all around, wide open spaces. Major culture shock for me. Also, I was meeting a lot of the other students who were from Long Island. They were middle class and upper middle class. And their values and the way they seemed to, for example, when I went to a friend's house, the way he treated his mother shocked me. He was just demanding snacks and yelling at his mom. I was like, who does that? But also, I had been very lucky to have a very, like I said, in Williamsburg, very diverse kind of community. High school itself was also much more diverse. And then college. So I was kind of okay with meeting people who had different backgrounds and stuff. What, interestingly enough, the toughest part I had with was the other Puerto Ricans or the other Latinx people. I wasn't sure how Latinx I was, if I was Latinx enough. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we didn't use that word back then. I think we were still using Hispanic, or we might have been using Spanish. But I was like, my Spanish was horrible. Oh, my parents, in that instilling in me to be successful, didn't want us to learn too much Spanish. They did not want us to have accents. They wanted us to master English because from their perspective, that's the way you got ahead in the world. So here I am in college, and I wanted to join the Latin American club, but they had a lot of parties, and my salsa dancing skills were very unremarkable, let's just say. So I still hung out with them a little bit, but it took a while. And I didn't finish in college. It took a while for me, maybe into my 20s, even my 30s, to really feel comfortable or feel a little bit more comfortable in my Latinx skinned. You know what I mean?
Reoccurring theme on this podcast is everyone feels like they're not enough, they're not doing it right. And it really does come down to like representation and how we see ourselves out in the world. And if we don't fit into those like three definitions that are out there, then also Latinx is like I'm realizing after interviewing like 100 people it's a social construct that like you can sort of just be anything and still apply.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's going to be different. The Latinx as an umbrella construct is useful politically. It's useful for marketing. I'll say the positive side is if there's a Mexican American guy or Mexican across the room from me, I kind of know something about him already.
Yeah.
We have a connection, even though he's a stranger, right? But at the same time, his concerns and his history is vastly different from mine, you know? So it's just like, it's almost like somebody from New York and somebody from Wisconsin. Yeah, it's the same country, but that's a whole different kind of way of thinking, a whole different kind of life, a whole different needs and stuff. So Latinx is fine, but it's inadequate, inelegant, ineloquent as a label, but it can be useful at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think it's a powerful organizing tool, and community is always good.
Yes.
Because I've never been to New York City. We have Puerto Ricans in Chicago. We have a lot, but as I understand it through the culture and just through the general media, that like Puerto Ricans from New York is like a whole different universe. So like, can you just talk to us about like your relationship with that, the identity, like how you've sort of come into it?
So first of all, just like in the movie West Side Story, we do dance everywhere. And we wear very bright colors. I'm always, everything's, we dance on the rooftop, and we like to live in America. No, the thing is, as a NUYORICAN, and actually I just did a reading group about NUYORICAN lit. We have this weird relationship with the United States, and then with New York, which a lot of Puerto Ricans came here first. And New York is, to me, of course, the greatest city in the world. You probably think Chicago is. I think New York City is, right? So it's that big melting pot of cultures, actually more like a stew, right? All these people come in, you hear all these different accents, you smell all these different kinds of foods here. Puerto Ricans, when they came in, they were part of the migration in the beginning of the 1900s. And for a while there, I don't think it ever became easy for them. A lot of Puerto Ricans who came here, there were colorism issues, skin color within the community itself. People weren't accepting them. They were like, are you Black or are you not Black? What's going on with that? There's a famous book called Down These Mean Streets by the NUYORICAN poet, writer, Piri Thomas. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's similar to Man-Child from the Promised Land. Came out in the 60s, and it was about how hard it was to figure out who Puerto Ricans were in this city that had this policy up till, I think, the Puerto Ricans had this policy of saying, okay, we're going to pick on you for about 2 generations and then you're okay, which is what they did with the Italians, what they did with the Irish. But with the Puerto Ricans, it was like, hold up now, you're still Puerto Rican. And that's what you're going to be. As much as I think there was a sense that the Latin culture was kind of sexy and exotic in the 1920s, creating that otherness, of course, about us and creating these stereotypes that we were talking about. The first big thing that in mass culture that said anything about Puerto Ricans was the movie West Side Story. And of course, what does it represent us as? Gangsters. We're all in a gang. So that's what people think about us in New York. And I think we tend to also fear, we have that sense in ourselves, oh, that person is a gangster. Like there's a sort of a self-hate sometimes or a judgment on ourselves because, oh, look, yeah. As soon as like somebody deviates from the norm, oh yeah, he's going to be a gangster. So I think it's been tough. It's sort of a schizophrenic existence. Similar to Puerto Rico's existence with the United States has been schizophrenic. Puerto Ricans in New York, NUYORICANs, have had a tough time. And by the way, so the term NUYORICAN was a bad thing to say, was pejorative. The Puerto Ricans from the island used to call the Puerto Ricans here NUYORICANs because they weren't Puerto Rican enough. Getting back to that theme that we were saying before about being LatinX, because their accent had shifted, because they weren't doing the same kinds of traditions. Things had changed for them. They thought perhaps that the NUYORICANs were starting to put on airs. You know, they thought they were better than the Islanders. So I think for NUYORICANs, there's like, you don't fit in here in New York quite, and you don't quite fit into Puerto Rico anymore either. I think the experience is just different, of course, for different people. But from a lot of the NUYORICANs I talk to, there is that sort of schism. Like, you're not quite home in Puerto Rico. New York City is a little bit more like home, but again, it's like within your community.
So like, what did you get up to after you got out of school? Like, did you have a plan? Did things go according to plan?
The idea was to take the novel I had written in the master's program and become a famous novelist. So that didn't work out. But what happened was, through some friends, I was able to get some freelance jobs as an editor and writer because, as you may know, most people hate writing. So when somebody finds out you can write, they're like, I need you for something. So I actually got little jobs here and there doing writing. And I also got jobs in magazine industry. And that really helped me out. My first job actually was in the adult magazine industry. I don't have to go into too much detail, but I used to write letters from the readers. And I would say, I never thought this would happen to me. But the other day, it was my first paying job, and they paid me well. And actually, so yeah, just to be clear, it's a dirty magazine. I showed it to my mom when I went for the interview. I said, Mom, would you mind it if I worked here? Because I was really, I was like, they're going to pay me. Again, the need to work. And she looked at the magazine and she just laughed. She said, go do it. She thought it was hilarious. And I did it for a little while, but after a while, I will say I got really uncomfortable because this isn't quite right. And I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. But it gave me some good training. And I went from there to other kinds of magazine jobs. And so I worked as a magazine writer for many years and a journalist. So I don't think the plan was to write short stories, to write fiction. And I had a few things published, but it wasn't going the way I wanted to, I think, for a lot of artists or just a lot of young people. I thought, like, I'm going to get a short story into the New Yorker. I'm going to get a novel out with Macmillan. Things are going to take off. And, by the time I'm in my 30s, I'm going to be wearing a tweed jacket, smoking a pipe, and just telling these stories to a group of undergrads. Well, let me tell you about my second novel. And, it didn't quite work out that way. So the plan didn't quite work. And it took me a while to get back on my feet as a writer.
So, yeah, let's talk about that transition. Because I think a lot of people experience this. Like, you're trying to pay the bills, you're trying to, you got rent due, you're living in this metropolis and it's not cheap. So, yeah. But I think for a lot of writers, it sort of comes to the point where they're just like, okay, you have to sort of make like a purposeful choice, or someone pushes you. So when was that shift to be like, okay, what do I actually want to do and how am I going to get myself there?
That shift, I got to say, it took a lot longer than I thought, which I think is, it might be educational to some of your listeners. So listen, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't doing it. And I think that there was some sort of, I hate the idea of a writer's block because I can't believe in writer's block. I think writer's block is like, you just, there's something you don't like, just change it and you'll be able to get past it. It's a simple thing. But I really think that I was resisting my dream. It was scary to actually do it. And I think this is a common problem for a lot of people. It's like, if you go on stage now and sing, that's your first step. And then they just, oh no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to sing. So for a long time, I just resisted writing. And what I did, I wrote a lot of just very silly, sarcastic, snarky poetry. I put up a little blog. I published myself. I did this for, I can't tell you how many years. And I had friends who loved, they all did it together. It was kind of funny. But it was basically very masturbatory in a way. Just like, I'm not going to try and get my stuff shown. I'm just going to do what I want to do for myself. And the thing is, that's fine. But when a writer says like they're doing, you just write for yourself. I think that's a little disingenuous, because if you want to get published, you need to understand that there's a reader there, that's a human being that you have to reach. And that's what art is about. You have to reach another person. So it's not just for you. So I was doing basically nothing until the early 2000s. And there was a call for authors for a thing. They wanted postmodern noir. And I didn't understand either of those terms, but I thought, hey, I think I could do that. And at this point, I think I was just ready. I had written some crime fiction in high school. I'd written a mystery story, and I used to read crime fiction quite a bit when I was younger. So I said, let me give this a shot. I looked at the dictionary definition of postmodern and of noir, and I wrote a story. It didn't get accepted there, but it got noticed by the editor, who said, we're not going to take this, but this other place will take you. And this is, again, I think a lesson about writing. Be friendly, be professional. You never know who's going to guide you in one direction or another. So this dude, he sent me to another place called Murderland, Murdaland, out of Baltimore, this magazine. Apparently there was a burgeoning crime fiction literature, like beyond the whole Sherlock Holmes kind of writing. And it totally fit in. This clicked with the kind of stuff I wanted to write. Not just straightforward drama, ay pobrecito stories. Here was something with a little action, a little pulp in it, if you will. But I was able to tell stories about my people, but also have these adventures, a little shock, a little violence, a little detective work. And for me, it clicked. So I did that one, and then I did another one. And then I got invited to do another one. And then I started to meet the right people. And that's basically how I finally got into, I think, the groove I had been wanting to get into since I was 18.
You know, I've read some of your writing, and I've definitely noticed the mystery, the noir, the murder. But what I've also noticed was that your stories are not, I think sometimes we get really pigeonholed into the types of stories we can tell as Latinx writers. And it has to be a very certain story, a certain perspective, certain narrative. And what I really appreciated of your stories, it was like, and I think for a while we were sort of like not a fan of people framing stories as they just happen to be. I think there was like a little bit of a like, we wanted more than that. But now I think we're sort of reversing back to, no, like, let's write like a mystery. Let's write like a sci-fi. Let's write a horror. And the character.
Like stuff with plot based instead of this. What literary writing? I think what you're saying, this idea that, this story just is, but let's have something with a little horror, a little mystery.
And it has Latinx characters, and the whole plot isn't writing on, they're Puerto Rican and they're from New York, and this is exactly this story. And that's what I really appreciated, because I think so rarely we see that. I think so rarely we're given the opportunity to just like be more and have a story that it's like, I'm an immigrant, I'm from Mexico, and like, does that mean every story I write is about crossing the border and like,
right?
And I think for a lot of times we felt like that narrative was missing, but I think some of those narratives have been done to death, and now I think we've shifted a little bit more to like, well, this person just happens to be Puerto Rican, this person just happens to be Mexican, but this is a universe they're living in, and this is their experience. And I especially love that you also touch on gentrification and things in the real world and where you're living, because it's all connected to that. It's not like the Puerto Rican gentrification story. It is like Puerto Ricans living in the city, and this story about like gentrification and with like a mystery and noir, and it's three-dimensional. I think for a long time we haven't really been allowed to like be as complex as we are as people.
That's what I said before, that ay pobrecito story. I think a lot of Latinx writers have been forced into that because that's what mainstream publishing wants. It's part of extending the stereotypes of, for example, the West Side Story. Like, oh, look how poor they are. They had to struggle so much. And then that's basically it. And Down These Mean Streets was basically that same kind of story. When I Was Puerto Rican by Esmeralda Santiago has a little bit of that too. Oh, look how horrible it was to live in Puerto Rico. And finally, she gets to New York City, and boom, within 2 chapters, she goes to Harvard. And this is that whole sort of like, this is the story, the Latinx story. It's just supposed to be how hard it is, and then success. And to make people feel better, so they don't have to worry about it so much. I think part of that is, and you're right. I think like for Mexican writers, Mexican American writers, I can feel, you guys probably feel guilty if like, oh, I should do a border story, right? I got to do a border story. And like, I feel, well, I got to write about poverty. I got to write about welfare. But no, we don't. And I think it's important for us to reach into the genres, which I think we've resisted for a long time. It's like, yeah, we have a place in this stuff. Oh, okay, maybe it's pulpy, maybe it's silly. Yeah, I've got like an octopus that breathes fire in my story, whatever. Maybe, but it's important for us because I think it'll help us reach other Latinx people, but also people who are not Latinx say, oh yeah, they're just as complex as us. It's not just dancing in the streets like gangsters, you know, and the sharks and jets kind of stuff. It's not just that, it's much more complex. And yeah, thank you. The very kind words that you said. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I was reaching for. I don't want to tell the ay pobrecito narrative. I want to take it a little farther.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think in recent years with like Jordan Peele, like he's had such success in the genre space just from like, and so like, I am curious of like when, because you were talking like you were on this journey and then you were like, you got into your groove. So like, what sort of stories were you telling and how do you feel like people are resonating with them?
The stories I started to tell as a crime fiction writer were not traditional mystery ones. And I felt a little weird about that. I thought that that's what was expected. The detective who solves crimes, you know, finds one clue, another clue, you're the killer kind of thing. I was writing this basically like literary stuff that examined maybe the Puerto Rican community of New York from a certain angle, but I would throw in some sort of crime fiction thing. Or I would just want to write, for example, about... like, for example, a corrupt lawyer. I wrote a story about a corrupt lawyer who was having an affair with somebody. He just happens to be Puerto Rican. Nothing to do with the story, like you were saying. But I wanted to have stories, crime fiction stories, not necessarily with a mystery, but with like a good plot and a good climax. And then the characters are just happen to be Puerto Rican so that people can say, oh, yeah, there's somebody like me. There's somebody with a name like mine. And isn't it wild? That's so weird. And it's not like, this is another thing I think that Latinx writers have to deal with. Not every character has to be a role model. It's not necessarily everybody has to be a hero. It's about just seeing yourself represented, even as a villain. So I was writing stories with really mean people because I like writing noir, which is a particular type of crime fiction. And that has to do a little bit with my sort of perhaps misanthropic worldview or dark worldview, maybe from living in New York City during the 1970s, where people, because of their greed or because of their lust, because of sometimes wanting too much, they can trip themselves up and destroy themselves. In a sense, they're like moral stories. So I've been writing a lot of moral stories in that noir sense with Latinx characters, you know, predominantly Puerto Rican and Nuyorican characters. The reaction has been... it's been slow coming, I think. I started off as basically an indie writer. My first book was a very, very tiny press. And as you may know, it's really hard to get any sort of recognition. And I do think the Latinx reading community was a little... they liked some indie stuff, but I think crime fiction, was a little different for a lot of Latinx readers because it's like... and I was a little wary of it too because we want to get away from being associated with crime too much, right? At the same time, there's this whole wide genre that's important to not lose, not just like cut ourselves out of. So I think it's been a little slow going in finding an audience within the Latinx community. I found in the generic and mainstream community, I think I've got a nice amount of readers. One can always use more, but I do wish I had more Latinx readers. And I think it's just beginning to happen this year.
Even with like podcasts, like how many like fiction, crime, murder, mystery podcasts are like through the roof. And I think just as a general public, we do crave those stories. So that's why I was really happy to see like ourselves in those stories, you know, like, and that's why like, especially this YA novel that you've released, that also caught my attention because I was like, oh, I would have picked this up. And like there are kids in like their school libraries and like my nephew's growing up. It's it's right there on the title, like Hernandez, like, you know, exactly. And it's like, what's this about? So can you sort of like just talk about like the inspiration for that book and like why get into the YA space?
This goes back to trying to find readers. I had noticed that a lot of Latinx readership, certainly through social media, that really loved YA. That's what they were writing about. That's what they seemed to be craving. A lot of it, however, was spec fic or horror. And I would realize, like, well, I was thinking, but there's an opportunity here. And it's like, I wonder if there's a Puerto Rican Nancy Drew. And I looked, I was like, there's no Puerto Rican Nancy Drew. How can there not be a Puerto Rican Nancy Drew? So I said, well, I'm going to make her up. So that's how I created Holly Hernandez. It was just this inspiration. And once she was created, I mean, she was like, in a sense, the best part of me during high school. Smart, funny, a little awkward still, but willing to try. And I first wrote a short story about her, just a contemporary thing, and it worked really well. And I gave her a rival, Xander Herrera, who was more of the socially awkward part of me, this big guy with, he had braces and thick glasses, and he just mumbles at everybody and just doesn't want to talk to anyone. So they made a great combination. So I wanted to write a book. The thing is, I haven't been 14 in a long time. So I said it in 1979, because that's when I was 14. And then it was such a rich opportunity there. And I really hope that younger readers get to explore it, because in writing it, I found out a lot about disco and how disco was important for the Latino community, for the African-American community, and the gay community. I hadn't realized it as much before, that this was a musical genre that had been written by marginalized people, but it was for marginalized people. And then it gets co-opted and super commercialized. And that's when everybody starts hating it. But it's not just the super commercialism. It's also this undercurrent of racism and anti-gay feelings that's where the anti-disco sentiment comes from. And I don't know if you know that there was a moment in the 70s where they took all these disco records and they blew them up. And that turned into like a riot. I can't believe, I mean, they blew a hole in the field just to blow up disco records. And that, I was like, people should know more about this. And look, okay, I started to do YA, so maybe this, I can only touch on it. I can hint at it, but I want to point people in that direction so they could, find out more on their own. But yeah, the inspiration was, I was just I needed to do a Puerto Rican Nancy Drew. And then disco just was the perfect, a perfect milieu. Hopefully I'll get to do another a sequel at some point.
Yeah, and it's also like, because I liked it because it was like, this is a thing I would read in school, like, those like YA novels where it's like a mystery, like, because it's like you have the Boxcar Children, you have like dozens of all these mystery books, and I read those all when I was a kid. But you also like inserted like the realities of like people when you have to do with crime with Black and brown people and how the system treats them, and like the complexities of that too, because it's like Nancy Drew, Boxcar Children never had to deal with institutional racism and like
right. Yes. No, that's what I was very, one of the things that I have, but the Nancy Drew character was, all right, things are going really well for her, but that doesn't make an interesting character. So I made her life a bit of a mess, and her mother has to deal with institutional sexism in the 1970s. But Xander Herrera, who's the other guy, once I realized that he was going to be a troublemaker, I realized, well, what would happen with a big, awkward, slightly darker skinned boy in the 1970s? And then I looked it up, and apparently New York City was deciding to really crack down on all crime. So he goes to one of the worst places in the city, he goes to Spofford. And I was like, on one night in Spofford would destroy people. It's an awful experience. And he's there for a whole weekend. those were tough chapters to write, but it was great to explore. And I hope that, people can, it's a part of part of things that we have to, part of something we still have to live with now. But it was just wonderful to explore that in the book, because his journey was much more heartbreaking than I thought it was going to be. At first, like, oh yeah, he's just going to be sarcastic. And then I was like, oh man, he's got to go to Spofford. It's tough to write.
Yeah, but that's the real, it's like, So you also released another book this year. So I want to talk about that, because I think it definitely like encapsulates who you are as a writer, but also like the possibility for Latinx people in genre. Because you sort of were like, let me just hit them all and like, but I think it's good because it's like, we see the possibility in all of these and these universes where we're at the center of it, and it's not the same old story we've heard before. We get to like be a little magical and like have adventures and all this stuff. So can you sort of talk about that book?
Yeah, so that book came out, the book's called Noir Eureka. which is, this just smacking noir, taking noir and sticking it on Nuyorican. It's probably not a great sellable title. Almost everyone I've spoken to is tripped over it. And if it went for a mainstream press, they probably would have told me to change the title. I think it encapsulates what I'm trying to say. I like noir, like I said before, but I really don't want to just play in crime fiction. I think it's important as a writer. I don't want to get pigeonholed. I want to be able to dance around. Say, let me try a little bit of horror. Let me try a little bit of spec fic, or let me just try something. I have no idea what this is, but I'm going to go in this direction anyway. So Noir Eureka is actually a compilation of short stories that I've written over the last 10 years that I cherry picked that had all definitely Puerto Rican characters and Nuyorican characters, because I wanted to have that explored. Like, this is a book just about those kinds of characters. However, it's not the typical narrative. We're not going to have, when I was Puerto Rican, we're not going to have down these mean streets. I'm going to take it in a different direction. And it's just so much fun to play with. Like, I do have a private detective story in there, but it's like, let me take him in a different direction, and perhaps more literary, but certainly darker as a private eye. I do hope people, when they read it, in particular Latinx and Puerto Rican people, can get to read the stories and just go, oh, wow, this is really cool. This is just, he's got a story about a superhero who just happens to be Latina, who's going through this identity crisis for what she has to do, because she has all this burden of her mother's legacy on her shoulders. And it's like, yeah, she just happens to be Latina, and you could see yourself there. And it's just like, we live in a world with most of our media, most of our movies, for example, and a lot of the stuff we watch on TV is larger than life. There's all these superhero movies. Why can't we see ourselves more often in there? Just like, oh, by the way, there I am. And I think these kinds of fantastical stories are important. All right, is it that literary? Am I going to get a Nobel Prize? That's not, it was so much fun to explore this. And I think that's what's important. And I hope the people who read it just see how much, experience fun as they read it. I might digress a little bit. You know that like in the 1920s, being Latin was so cool. I mentioned it before, like Ramon Navarro was like one of the biggest actors of all, of that era. But of course, once sound shows up, we're kicked to the curb, because now we're exotic. And also World War II is coming. So there's a lot of xenophobia happening. And then the next time we really see Hispanics again, or Latinos, is Mexican Spitfire movies. And then again, the next time, West Side Story. And so we're wallowing in stereotypes for generations. And then we become more and more marginalized. We're the sidekick for a long time. And we persisted into the 90s and the aughts, just the funny, loud sidekick. And that still happens, But every once in a while, I'll see a movie where, there's a Latino person who doesn't have to scream in an accent, which is what you used to have to do before. Well, if we're going to make him Mexican, well, he better say something Mexican, right? Or why else? Why do we bother? Then we can just get somebody else. So make sure that he goes, he does some sort of cursing in Spanish. That's what we need.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we've moved a little bit beyond it, but not as far as we need to.
There's always work to do.
There's always work to do, yes.
So where can people get your books? Like, where can they follow you?
Oh, so generally you could find everything for me on my website, www.richie.narvaez.com. And it's RICHIENAR, V as in Victor, AEZ as in zebra. And then I'm on Instagram quite a bit, and that's RNZ1000. So they can find me through there. They can find out my books through there. Yeah, and I'm readily Googleable.
So I like to ask my guests, who are some of the writers that you admire? So these could be heroes, peers, friends, people who you creep on social media. There's
a guy who's actually, he's an early Nuyorican writer who gets forgotten. His name is Jesus Colon. And he wrote about Nuyoricans in the city in the 1910s, 1920s. And his first book is called The Puerto Rican New York. And it's wonderful. It's all these little vignettes. And I think it's an important text for a lot of Puerto Ricans and Latinxes to read. And I recommend it because it gets forgotten. I also want to recommend Edwin Torres gets forgotten. Edwin Torres was the first Puerto Rican crime fiction writer with a book called Carlitos Way, which you may know from the movie. It's that movie, and I mean that book, and a book called After Hours that got made into Carlitos Way. He was kind enough to give me a blurb for Noir Eureka. His books are hard to find because I don't think they're in print anymore. So you have to find them through used bookstores and book websites. It's a very, I will give you this caveat. It's a book that was written in the 70s. When you read stuff or see stuff from the 70s, you always have to understand that they were still working things out. Sometimes they're trying to be very liberal, but oh man, some of the things that get said. But I think it's an important book for crime fiction. And then I also, more recently, I don't know if you've heard of Ivelisse Rodriguez, Love War Stories. It's a book of short stories. She's from, we often talk about, we were talking a lot about Puerto Ricans in New York City. She's from, I think it's Boston. Like there's large populations of Puerto Ricans in other parts of the country that we tend to forget about. So it's a great book of short stories that I recommend. And she's somebody that I stalk on social media a little bit. I could do more, but I think that's enough.
I am curious, like, what got you into this like space? Like, why these themes? Why this? Like, why is this sort of storytelling attractive to you? You know?
Oh, that's a good question. I tend to think that everybody who gets into crime fiction and noir usually had an association with crime when they were younger, positive or negative, but there was some large part of that in their lives. And I did mention it before. So my father was a man, he had several families, but also had several jobs, which he needed to support the families. So he worked at the JFK airport doing maintenance. He was a handyman, but he was also a numbers runner. So he ran numbers. And the thing is, since he didn't live with us, my mother made an arrangement with him that he would come by every afternoon so we wouldn't be latchkey children. She had a full-time job. So when we came home, my father was there and he would make us lunch. And he would be doing the numbers on the phone. He'd get a phone call every 5 minutes. You know how the numbers works, right? And the thing is, on Saturdays was his pickup day. So he would come by and we would go on a drive with Papi and he would go pick up money from these people. And the thing is, it was normal. And one time he threw a wad of bills in my lap and he said, "That's $10,000. And I was just looking at this money in my lap knowing this is not going to happen again. And the thing is, like, there was a sort of a fascination with crime that developed. And I think that continued. That's why I got into reading a lot of Raymond Chandler, detective novels, Agatha Christie, stuff like that. And it just blossomed. And when I got that thing about postmodern noir to write a story for it, it's like, it fit me perfectly.
So I like to have my guest help me title the episode. Mm-hmm. So the prompt is a blank Latinx writer. So you can put as many words you want in the blank. You can mix them all around. You can change up some of the words, just whatever feels true to you, this conversation you're writing. I also use it as a community building tool. Someone will see the title and be like, oh, that's like me. Like, I should follow this person. I should listen to the interview. I should check out their work.
All right. So I am a genre-busting Gen X, NUYORICAN, Latinx writer.
Perfect.
Like that? Okay.
Yeah. I knew the NUYORICAN was going to be in there somewhere. All the Puerto Ricans are like Boricua. They always put it, they love it.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I think it goes back to like, we have to show like extraordinary pride, because I think there's a lot of times we get pushed down a lot. For a long time, if you see a lot of old movies, every Latinx character was Puerto Rican, whether or not he was Mexican. It's like, oh, those bunch of Puerto Ricans did this and that. You see it a lot on TV. It's like they couldn't mention Mexican. They had to say Puerto Rican. And so we were like the target bad demographic for a long time. And I think there is an insecurity that needs to be overcome. Also, I mean, we still get our asses kicked with the fucking hurricanes. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, damn, something else. And then our politicians are awful.
Yeah.
Except for AOC, who's a goddess.
And we all root for her. She is our role model for the next 20 years, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a new J-Lo, I think.
Yes.
So with that, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was such a fun conversation. I really enjoy the work. I recommend to all the listeners to check out your writing. It's definitely what we need, you know?
Yes. Thank you, Ruben. Thank you.